morning, everyone, and welcome to this TSG Animal Feed Pet Food webinar. I'm so happy you were able to take the time out of your day to join us for this session. My name is Kelly Ron, and I manage the state office for TSG. I have been with TSG for several years, and prior to joining, held a few different industry regulatory affairs positions spanning more than 30 years. Our state services office is located in Sacramento, California, right across the park from the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, and although located in California, we provide services in all states for not only animal feed and pet food, but also for fertilizers, amending materials, and all types of pesticides. I'm pleased to be able to introduce you to my colleague, Shannon Bryant-Spas, who has been with TSG for over 6 years. Over the course of her 20-year career, Shannon has managed a wide variety of projects in the environmental and chemical arenas. Shannon currently manages our team of state consultants, and in addition to providing expert guidance on the state issues that impact animal feed and pet food, she also specializes in the state regulation of fertilizers, amending materials, and organic certifications. One item worth noting at the outset of our time together is that while Shannon will provide an overview of federal regulatory landscape for these products, she does focus her practice area on state affairs. Should any detailed federal questions come up today, we will seek answers from our colleagues in our sister TSG office located in Washington, D.C., where our federal regulatory and scientific staff reside. For those of you who are not familiar with TSG Consulting, I wanted to say a few words about our firm. We have been providing companies around the world with regulatory guidance and scientific expertise for 30 years. We help clients address the technical and regulatory issues associated with taking their products to market in multiple jurisdictions. TSG has offices in the U.S., Canada, and throughout Europe, as well as strategic partnerships throughout the world. For those of you that are familiar with TSG, you may not know that we are part of the Science Group, which is listed on the London Stock Exchange. Science Group serves a number of key markets and industry sectors, including agriculture, industrial, consumer, food and beverage, animal health, and medical. There are over 500 of us around the globe. We speak over 30 languages, have 12 offices around the world, as well as 2 dedicated R&D facilities. One last bit of housekeeping. I will be monitoring the questions you send through chat, and I have set aside about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Shannon.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I am going to be talking about animal feed and pet food, and this is our agenda, kind of a brief overview of the differences between animal feed and pet food, an overview of the federal regulatory landscape, then a state overview, briefly on supplements, and then a little bit about what we think might be coming down the pike. So what is the difference between animal feed and pet food? Well, first, you really need to understand what the definition of food is. So the term food means articles used for food or drink for man or other animals, and then any articles used for components of such an article. And that's from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So commercial feed is materials or combinations of materials that are intended to be fed to or mixed into the feed for animals. That's the definition from the AFCO model bill, and we'll talk about AFCO here in a little bit. Pet food is actually a subset of commercial feed. It's specifically for cats and dogs, so pets are cats and dogs. Specialty pet food is another subset of commercial feed, and it is for companion animals, those animals commonly kept in tanks or cages, and that'd be like your snakes, birds, hamsters. So kind of an overview of the federal regulatory landscape for feed. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act gives FDA the authority over food for humans and animals. And within FDA, it's the Center for Veterinary Medicine that's responsible for regulating animal feed. CVM works with the Association of American Feed Control Officials, or AFCO, through a memorandum of understanding. And that allows AFCO to administer a process for defining ingredients for feed. A little bit about AFCO. They're an organization that's a group of regulators, both from the state and the federal level, as well as Canada. And their goal is kind of to harmonize the regulatory landscape for feed, for animal feed. But they have no actual regulatory authority beyond that they maintain the definitions that are acceptable for feed. So AFCO works to develop uniform policies for regulating the use of animal feed products. They establish uniform feed ingredient definitions, and they work to create labeling standards to assure the safe use of that feed. So at the federal level, animal feed ingredients are evaluated in one of three ways. They could be done through a food additive petition, as an independent conclusion of GRAS, or an AFCO new ingredient definition process. Ingredient reviews and approvals are generally for a specific species and usage, and in this case, the intended use is really both how the ingredient's going to be used and also any limitations on its use. So for example, chocolate has a limitation that you wouldn't want to feed it to dogs. Similarly, copper is not something that you want to give to sheep. If you have new uses or new ingredients, or new species for an existing ingredient, you're going to go through that same process. So a little bit about food additive petitions. The process for these is defined at 21 CFR Part 571, and the data that's required for a food additive petition is extensive. You have to have data that supports the intended effect of the ingredient, as well as data that supports safety, both in the target animal and possibly also in humans. You need an environmental assessment and also data that shows any proposed tolerances, in addition to information about the identity and composition of the ingredient, and that includes manufacturing information. This data can be from proprietary sources and studies, but it does take at least 2 years for CVM to complete their review of a food additive petition. It can take a lot longer. So this is a time-consuming and also expensive process because of the amount of data that you need to generate. Independent conclusions of GRAS, and GRAS is generally recognized as safe. That process is defined at 21 CFR 570.35. For these, the data actually has to be in the public domain, meaning that it's been published likely in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It can involve review by an expert panel, and it can speed up the process because you're eliminating that regulatory body review. However, there are many states that are wary of the independent conclusion of GRAS process, both from the sense that they're not confident that companies are actually completely following that process, as well as being concerned about whether the review process is rigorous enough. So companies do have the option of submitting their independent conclusions to CVM for review, definitely at the discretion of the company, and that review does take time. CVM is required to respond within 180 days, but they do have the ability to extend that timeline on an as-needed basis. So it does take time to complete that review. Ideally, at the end of that process, CVM will issue a no questions letter, which indicates that they don't have any questions regarding the conclusion that was reached. However, of the roughly 34 food additive petitions that have been reviewed and posted on CVM's website, only 19 of them actually have a no questions letter. The remainder were either withdrawn or CVM did not agree with the conclusions. And then we'll move on to the AFCO new ingredient definition. So That helps to identify the safety, utility, and identity of ingredients used in animal feed. It helps to ensure that the ingredients are suitable for the intended use and also establishes a common and usual name. So for an ingredient to actually qualify for a new definition, it needs to be consistent from batch to batch. It can't be a combination of other ingredients, and it has to be intended to provide nutrition, color, taste, or aroma, which is basically what feed is supposed to do or food is supposed to do, or it's supposed to have a technical effect of the feed, such as, say, an anti-caking agent. These ingredients cannot have human health concerns. If they do, then that needs to go through a food additive petition. They do proceed through a formal review process, both within AFCO and then also it goes to CVM for a review of safety and efficacy data. The definitions have to be non-proprietary in nature, meaning it can't be so specific to a particular company's process that no one else would be able to use the definition. Again, this can be a lengthy process, both because you include that review that includes CVM, and then also because AFCO has parliamentary procedures that they have to go through. We did a kind of a rough estimate, and the best case for approval this way would be 16 to 19 months, but that is very optimistic. It rarely happens that fast. It usually takes much longer. The nice thing about this process is it is accepted by the states. An ingredient that is AFCO approved is not going to raise questions from state regulators. That's also the same with feed additive petitions. So just to touch briefly on the kinds of claims that would be acceptable for, especially for grass ingredients, but they have to be related to, say, a technical effect on the ingredient or on the feed, so maybe improving digestibility, or it could be a claim related to supporting an animal's natural defenses. Unacceptable claims are related to, say, production claims, so increases in milk production would be unacceptable. In addition, any claims that are related to the prevention, treatment, or mitigation of a disease is going to be unacceptable. A good example here would be say, Cheerios when they were claiming to reduce cholesterol. So we'll kind of pop over briefly into the state overview. How is feed regulated at the state level? Typically, it's regulated through the state's Department of Agriculture, and they are also responsible for enforcement of current good manufacturing practices under FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act. They regulate the product as sold, so that could be an ingredient or it could be a finished product, and it can even include treats if you're making nutritional claims for those products. Basically, licensing or registration is required in every state where the product is sold, and some states do have separate regulations for specialty pet food in addition to their normal commercial feed regulations. Requirements for licensing and registration actually vary by state, by the intended species, and also by product size. So some states require a company license, some states require product registration, and some states actually require both. There can be different requirements for registration depending on if the product is a pet or specialty pet feed versus a commercial feed. And there can also be differences based on whether the product is sold in bulk or large packages or sold in small packages. And to further complicate matters, small packages are actually defined differently at the state level. So what's the most challenging part of state registrations? Really getting labeling correct is one of the more challenging parts. You're looking at 49 different sets of laws and regulations, 49 different regulatory bodies, and potentially 49 different interpretations. The requirements for labeling are different depending on the species and also the intended use of the product, whether it's, say, a vitamin supplement versus a complete feed. And also claims can really cause compliance issues. You need to remember that both text and images are considered part of your claims, and they have to be consistent with uses of feed. So again, you're providing nutrition, taste, aroma, flavor, or some kind of a technical effect on the feed. States evaluate those labels and formulations for compliance. They are looking to make sure ingredients are approved and looking at the usage, because the ingredients need to be not only approved, but you need to be using them in a manner which is consistent with their approved definition. Some states actually may not accept novel ingredients that have independent conclusions of GRAS unless there is also a no objections letter from CVM. So you get into the having to negotiate with the state regulators and try and make that, convince them to accept something that they are very skeptical of. States are also looking at the required nutritional and other information, making sure that that's present on the label and making sure that the formatting on the label is appropriate. So there's a lot that they're evaluating. Once you actually achieve your state registration or licensing and you have your product free to sell, you enter what we call a maintenance phase, which basically means maintaining your compliance so you can have uninterrupted sales. You are going to have to think about the fact that the cycles for maintenance actually vary by state. You have renewals of either your license or your registration, and then you also have tonnage reporting, which is effectively a sales tax. States can have that be done on a quarterly basis. Some states have semi-annual, and then other states have annual reporting for tonnage. And in addition to this, you have the option or the potential for random product sampling and analysis, and that's really designed for the states to ensure that your product is meeting your guarantees. So you really want to make sure that whatever your guarantees are, your product can meet those guarantees throughout the life cycle of the product. So we'll touch just briefly on supplements. The Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act of 1994 does not apply to animal feed. CVM has determined that products that are marketed as dietary supplements or feed supplements for animals are either food or new animal drugs, depending on the intended use. CVM does exercise some regulatory discretion for supplements that are used in non-food chain animals, so your companion animals, your pets, your specialty pets, and horses. There is no such regulatory discretion for food chain animals. When you're making claims for animal supplements, you need to remember the purpose of the product is largely determined by the claims. So claims can't be excessive or extravagant in terms of structure or function of the body. If you're claiming to support the normal function of the body, that's generally considered to be a feed. If you're marketing or claiming to improve or enhance some function of the body, such as joint health, that's likely going to be viewed as a new animal drug. Some examples, if you're claiming on your product that you reduce dry and itchy skin for dogs, that's likely going to be considered a drug claim. If you are claiming to support a normal, healthy coat for dogs, that's more of a food claim. And you need to remember that images are also part of your label claims, and those should be consistent with your written claims. In addition, information that's on your website or in any of your marketing materials can also be considered to be claims. So kind of what do we say looking toward the future? Well, kind of the general rule of regulatory is that regulations become more complex over time. They don't generally become less complex. So we would anticipate more regulation down the pike. We know that ASCO is in the process of developing new labeling standards for pet and specialty pet feed, and that's obviously going to require some revision to existing labels. We also know that ASCO is considering creating a review process of their own for independent conclusions of GRAS. The idea here would be that it would give states more confidence in those independent conclusions. However, it's definitely in the early stages of discussion, and it is not clear that all states would actually accept this review either. Some other considerations, regulatory changes that are going to be based on innovative technologies. There are all kinds of innovative new products coming into the market, and the regulatory framework really isn't set up to deal with these. So we really work hard to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of what's going on. We are, through participation in ASCO meetings, we also are actively involved in trade organizations such as the American Feed Industry Association, so AFIA. We participate in AFIA committees such as the Feed Regulatory Committee, the Ingredient Approval and Definition Committee, the Pet Food Committee, and the International Trade Committee. So we're really wanting to make sure that we know what regulators are talking about and considering, but we also understand industry's perspective. So that's a big part of what we do. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly.
Thank you, Shannon, very much for all of that information. One thing I wanted to do with this group is to go through a case study slide. I think it's important to go back to real-life examples to illustrate some of the things we can help with. So one thing that TSG, we were approached by a multinational company. They were struggling with the complexity inherent in having over 300 animal feed products throughout the entire U.S., given that each state does things differently from one another. They struggled with in-house resourcing for the work it takes to maintain vast numbers of registrations for both renewals and tonnage reporting. I'm sure that there are folks on the phone that can relate to that, to relate to the difficulties with those large volumes of paperwork and different due dates. So this company that approached us provided TSG with basically a data dump. They gave us all of the certificates, submissions, and labels that they were able to pull together. TSG weeded through the documents, sorted them out, and populated a database with this information. We quickly discovered that while they had over 8,000 individual state registrations, there were concerning gaps as this company tended to apply for state registrations reactively based on sales rather than proactively based on a geographical strategy. We worked through a full cycle of renewals and tonnage porting. Our client ended up with a full complement of registrations and licenses that gave them confidence that there was no longer preventable enforcement activity lurking around the next corner. This client is still with us today, and they appreciate the peace of mind that comes with knowing that TSG is on top of all of their various deadlines, that we can tell them exactly which label version is in which state, that we provide them with a fixed fee for this service, making internal budgeting exercises easy, and that they no longer need to deal with staff turnover and training during a critical renewals month. So I know, without even being able to hear you, that your burning question is, what can TSG do for you? So I want to take a minute to highlight our state service offerings in Sacramento. In our Sacramento office, we have 15 employees dedicated to handling new state registrations and maintaining existing registrations. This distinguishes us from other consulting firms as we have the staff and the infrastructure to handle large volumes of work, especially during critical renewal and tonnage months. We process upwards of 40,000 state registration actions per year. Our core state service offerings are captured on this slide. As you can see, we can assist you through the lifetime of a state registration, beginning with helping you develop that label, moving through obtaining your registrations, and then maintaining those registrations for as long as you hold them. As a thank you, we're going to email you the paper we developed entitled Animal Feed and Pet Food, Understanding the U.S. Federal and State Regulatory Framework, along with the webinar recording and the slide deck we just worked through. So we still have some time, and I think it would be good now for us to turn over and answer some of the questions we received during the WebEx. We've had several from participants, and we will get through as many of these as we possibly can. So first question, Shannon, we have a caller asking, I want to sell my product online. Is it enough to be registered in the state in which I am located?
You actually need to be registered or licensed in every state where you're going to sell. So whether your product is shipped into that state, states define distribution as the product being sold into the state, not the state where you're located, but the state where the product actually ends up. So if you're selling online, we generally recommend that you be registered throughout the country, unless you can very tightly control where your product is going to be.
Okay. Another question we received. Why are there only 49 sets of laws? Does one state not have any?
That's actually true. Alaska does not regulate animal feed at all.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So, why can't I use a GRAS ingredient for humans in all animal feed?
An ingredient that's been determined to be GRAS in human isn't also necessarily safe for animals. You know, we mentioned chocolate before. That would probably be considered GRAS in humans, but certainly not safe for dogs. Animals have different metabolisms. Their bodies work differently, and so the ingredients are going to be processed differently.
That goes back to your slide on no copper for sheep.
Yes.
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 Okay.
And that's why also GRAS notifications or GRAS independent conclusions are specific to a species.
Makes sense. Okay. Another question. Can you please provide a real example of a pet treat that does not require any registration?
Pet treats, in general, if you're making claims about providing nutrition or the product is digestible, those products are going to require registration. Products like horns or hooves, where you're not making any kind of digestibility claims, are generally going to be excluded from registration. However, it's always a good idea to confirm that with state regulators.
Are there any states that don't require licensing? Oh, I apologize for that. We have already answered that question. I make dog treats in my home and only share them in my neighborhood. Do I have to register them?
If you're not selling a product, then generally you're not going to require registration. If you're just giving them away to family and friends or using them for your own use, then you wouldn't require registration. The minute you try and sell them, so you take them to a farmer's market and sell them, they do require, you do require compliance under whatever the state you're in feed laws.
Okay. If I were to change the graphics or format of a label for a product that is already state registered, do I need to inform the states of the change?
States appreciate having the most current label on file, but changes that are minor, that don't affect claims, that don't affect the guarantee, can likely be provided to the state at renewal time. If you're changing any of the major components, that needs to be addressed with the state regulators right away.
Okay.
And in some cases, it's actually going to require new registration.
Okay. In one of the slides, you said that AFCO is developing new labeling standards. When are these expected, and how long will my company have to comply?
AFCO is actually still very much in the process of developing those. They're still within committee. So it's going to have to be finalized in committee, then voted to go to the membership, or to go to the board, then the membership. So I would say that we're probably a year or more away from that. There's already discussion of providing a time frame for companies to comply with those new labeling standards. I've heard 2 years thrown around, but that also is not yet defined. So it's a to be determined situation.
Okay. Another question, and we're doing well on time still. So, can I make statements on my website that don't appear on my label?
In theory, yes. Those statements would need to be not claims. They need to be consistent with whatever claims you're making on the label. You can't, for example, say things on your website that would imply that your product is serving some other purpose than feed. It needs to be any statements, any claims that you make about your product need to be consistent with the use of feed.
Okay. So I am going to, even though I'm supposed to be serving as moderator, I'm going to give Shannon a break here for a minute and take one of the questions that we received from a caller. We were asked, what happens if CVM doesn't agree with the Gross conclusion? In other words, won't issue a no questions letter. Is the product not allowed to be self-affirmed as Gross? My understanding of that is what we would suggest you do as a company is work with CVM to figure out what they don't agree with and see if you can work through that issue. Sometimes you can make a modification that may make it acceptable. But at the end of the day, if they disagree and they won't issue that letter, federal law allows you as a registrant to do a self-conclusion of Gross. It's just that when you get to the state regulators, it's probably going to be a large hurdle for you to get over in order to get the state regulators to accept that you've decided it's an acceptable use when CVM disagrees with you. So in theory, you have the right to move forward. In practice, it probably won't get you very far. So I think if there are any more questions that we can answer, we have one more. Are there any plans to standardize requirements across the states?
In an ideal world, that would happen, but because there's individual state laws, the model bill at AFCO is actually designed to provide a framework for states to adopt that will be harmonized, basically. However, each state has to, in some way, change their feed law or adopt that model bill. So even if the goal is for a state to say, yes, I want to do this thing that AFCO is doing, I want to be part of that, you have an uphill battle to change legislation and regulation in the states. It has to go through the legislative process. And in addition, there are some states that don't actively participate in AFCO. So I would not say that there's going to be a great deal of harmonization any more than there already is. And in reality, we've actually seen a little bit of an uptake in divergent opinions on different things. So it maybe is a little less harmonized than it was.
Okay. So with that, I have been flagged as we're coming to the end of our time together. I can't believe it's run short already. Thanks everybody for attending. Again, we'll be sending each of you the paper that we recently developed, as well as a recording of the webinar. Please have a good rest of your day, and let us know if we can be of any service to you in the future. Thank you for listening.